Hello, good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kutan.
And you're watching Consider This. Today on the show, we have GANESH KUMAR BANGAH, who is the champion for the ICT Productivity Nexus, which is one of 9 areas of focus under the Malaysia Productivity Blueprint, which was launched back in May of 2017. So the idea is to raise labour productivity, make it easier for businesses to do business here in Malaysia. Welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
So let's set the scene a little bit, and why don't you tell us precisely what your role is as champion for the ICT Productivity Nexus?
Sure. So my role as champion of the ICT Productivity Nexus is to increase the productivity of the IT industry here in Malaysia. But even more than that, the IT industry today is not an industry on its own, but it's also an enabler to other industries. So we also look at how our industry can also help the other industries also increase their productivity by adopting ICT.
Right, because I mean everything is technology linked right now. It's really hard for it to be one nexus by itself, right?
And if you actually look at what's needed to increase productivity, technology is a key component, right?
Sure.
Right. So what specifically are we looking at when you talk about this sector? I mean, who are the key players, you know, and so give us a granular sense of the sector that you kind of bringing together in order to push this agenda forward.
So the IT industry basically encompasses a number of different components. You have the industry itself, which are basically the enablers.
Okay.
So if you look at the technology enablers, you have the software, the hardware, the system integrators that put everything together, right? And of course, then you have the academia, which generate the talent, which is also key for our industry, right? That can actually then provide these technologies to the users.
Okay.
Right, so you have the vendors, the users, and the academy that provides the talent.
So that would be the ecosystem.
Yes.
Right.
And when we're thinking about making sure that the productivity is maximized, or to increase the productivity of this of ICT, what are the challenge areas? What are the pain point areas? You mentioned talent is one area where you're looking at coming out from academia, right? What else are we looking at?
So I think the Malaysian Productivity Blueprint actually identified 4 key issues, right? And those 4 issues can be broken up to 3 key areas. The first is talent. As many people know, in this industry, there's a huge mismatch between the talent produced in the universities versus the talent that is actually needed by the industry. And a big reason for this is not really because the universities are not producing or don't know what to produce or don't know the kind of talent to produce, but it's because our industry just changes so fast.
Can you give us an example of
So
what
for
kind
example,
of
if you look at Industry 4.0 today, how many of our talent coming out of universities actually understand how to implement IR 4.0? Right? So by the time they come out of university, the syllabus that they actually learning in university could be 4 or 5 years old. By the time they come out, what they learn is already out of date. Right?
But I would have thought that when you go to university, you are trained to have the capacity to take on new knowledge. I mean, to continually look at what the industry is producing, and you already have, as it were, the grammar for it. So it's just extending that.
And you continue learning,
no,
right?
you are right, because for example, people talk about AI being something new. But if you actually look at the computer science textbooks, the word AI has been around for 20, 30 years.
Right.
It's just the application of it today is different. The issue today is for the talent coming out of universities today to implement these new applications. There's still a bit of reskilling that they actually need to go through. So that talent mismatch, right, or skills mismatch is what is one of the issues identified under the Malaysian Productivity Blueprint.
Right. Considering the nature of, say, technology and innovation, right? If it's going at breakneck speed and universities can't keep up because universities are slightly more moribund, they're thinking curriculum, and they maybe have to have some bureaucrat, kind of certify that, then where can that dynamic be injected in terms of the education system? Is it industry that's going to be providing the hands-on, the training necessary? You take the university students, but then you actually educate them again.
Yes, industry is a key part of it. At the same time, there are also tools and applications that the talent themselves need to adopt. Lifelong learning is now a key word. You can't just learn whatever you learn in university by the time you come out, as I mentioned earlier, is out of date. Lifelong learning, micro learning, today there are apps where you can learn small bits or pieces every day as you go to work. And over 1 year, you basically learn a whole new technology, a whole new application.
So just to follow up on Sharaad's question then, if you are looking to correct that mismatch, I mean, first of all, whose role would that be? And how do you even go about correcting such a, I mean, it's almost nuanced and it's ever changing, right? It's ever going to be changing what industry needs and what academia puts out.
Sure. So because it is the talent issue affects productivity, the ICT Nexus has a role to play in terms of improving that productivity. That doesn't mean that we're doing the training. I see. Right? So we look at platforms, for example. I'll give you one example. India actually launched Nexus Skills also, or they launched Future Skills actually in India. And what Future Skills did was actually they provide a platform that matches the talent together and also provides lifelong learning applications with AI. Right, so they know what you learn or what your knowledge is by asking you a set of questions, then provide you the syllabuses that can help you grow. So it's stuff like that that we look at.
Okay. Some interesting ways in which we do things in Malaysia. A lot of initiatives come from government. Which is not necessarily true in the advanced industrial world, right? It's usually privately led and so on and so forth. Do you think we have the balance right here? You know, is government too dominant? Is the private sector always waiting for government's handouts and and signals? I mean, what do you think the balance is like?
The ICT Nexus is driven by the private sector. The government actually comes in to help facilitate what the private sector needs. That's why as champion of the ICT Nexus, I represent the industry and I'm also the chairman of PCOM, the National Tech Association of Malaysia. So we represent our members. We hear from our members what they need and bring it up to the Nexus as well.
Can I just get you to explain what is it that you're hearing from your members? From what are you hearing from the ground? What is it they need?
Sure. So I think, look, we are blessed in Malaysia. For the last 20 years, we've had a lot of incentives for our industry. Right? Ever since the Multimedia Super Corridor came about, we had a whole suite of incentives, both fiscal and non-fiscal, to help the industry. In the current budget, there's also been a lot of focus on the digital economy as well. But one of the issues we see is that a lot of the incentives today are actually funding-based incentives and not application-based incentives. Now, you may ask, what is funding-based incentives or application-based incentives? I'll give you one example, our Industry Forward initiative, the Industry 4.0 initiative. We've got, I think the government has allocated 3 billion ringgit to help fund IR 4.0. It's under Bank Pembangunan, this is one application, but you see, if you put a $3 billion fund in a bank, they'll give out ticket sizes of 10 to 20 million ringgit loans. So if you look at 10 to 20 million ringgit loans for implementing IR 4.0, the SMEs can't adopt that. It's really the big companies. So what about the SMEs, right? And you know, our economy is driven by SMEs. Now, if you then look at the SMEs and ask them whether they want to adopt IR 4.0 or AI or digitalization, today, because they know if they don't adopt digitalization, they'll be out of business. They want to adopt it. But the issue is they don't know how.
Okay, well, let's come back and discuss about how we can bridge that knowledge gap. We'll be back with more on Consider This. Make sure you stay tuned. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here, and we're chatting to GANESH KUMAR BANGAH, who is the champion for the ICT Nexus, ICT Productivity Nexus under the Malaysia Productivity Blueprint. So, GANESH, just before the break, we were talking about incentives, right? The funding-based incentives, lots of that versus application-based. Now, talk to us a little bit about this lack of awareness of the different types of incentives, because SMEs don't really know where to go to get these incentives.
Now, I think the root cause of the not knowing where to go is really not understanding what the incentives are for. Right? So, for example, if an industry is, if an incentive is for Industry 4.0, how many SMEs actually understand what Industry 4.0 is? or what artificial intelligence
and
is.
how it relates to their business,
and how it
right?
relates to their business, or what RPA is, robotic process automation, right? 80% of SMEs don't even understand these buzzwords.
Right.
And
Well,
the
50% of this team didn't understand that word.
right? So there's a lot of buzzwords in this industry, and that's kind of the trend in the tech industry, for better or worse, is that we always confuse everybody else by these buzzwords. And because of that, when you have then incentives for digitalization, for AI enablement, for IR 4.0, the lack of awareness is also caused by the lack of understanding.
Sure.
So the source of it is actually lack of understanding of what the incentive is for.
Is the source of it a lack of communication, and that's why there's a lack of understanding?
Part of it, but another source of it is people don't see the real life applications, and that's a bigger. So you can talk about digitalization, as I mentioned earlier, but if you don't see how it relates to your life, you can mention AI 100 times, but you don't see how it can improve your lives.
Is there a question of the cost of adoption of new technologies? You know, you said earlier that everybody recognizes that around the corner things are going to change.
Yes.
And, right? But there must be real concern about whether they can absorb the cost of the adoption of these technologies, and what will be the returns. I mean, how dramatically improved will their returns be?
Sure, I think that's where the government has come in. They recognize that, look, SMEs can't absorb a lot of this cost up front, which is where the government has come in and provided grants and loans to fund some of these applications, right? And you have a right point that you brought up on ROI. Now, ROI can only be proven if you've already applied it, right? So only once you apply a particular technology or it's been applied to a similar business can you actually see returns. And that's why I keep stressing that application-based incentives are more important than actually funding-based incentives, right? Because if you provide funding-based incentives, that ROI is unproven. But if you provide application-based incentives, there will actually be other applications or other SMEs that have applied that and seen ROI. And if other similar SMEs have seen the ROI, tendencies you would also see the ROI.
Well, you know, I was about to ask about that, whether the incentives are actually the accurate ones, and something you alluded to a bit earlier, because not only, you know, whether they're the right incentives, there are so many different bodies giving out these incentives, right? It feels like almost every other agency or you know, bank or financial institution is providing these types of grants. It feels quite fragmented, and I'm wondering, as a champion of the ICT Productivity Nexus, whether you have a bit of a bird's eye view on that.
We do have a bird's eye view, and to be honest, it's a bit confusing. Just to be totally honest, because we have so many different ministries that actually are involved in the tech industry. Just to give you an idea, of course, the Ministry of Communications and Multimedia is kind of the key driver for a lot of IT initiatives. But then you're the Ministry of Entrepreneurship.
That's right.
That focuses on SMEs and also has a drive on innovation and digitalization through MAGIC.
Yeah, all the agencies under that.
And then you have MISMATCH, which is the funding agencies are under MISMATCH, right? EOB Yin's ministry.
That's right.
And then you have MITI that oversees e-commerce.
Wow.
So you have 4 or 5 ministries that actually oversees this entire industry. So one of the things that we, at least on behalf of PCOM, National Tech Association, we've actually been talking about is having a single tech ministry that can oversee this entire industry. Now,
are there other governance structures? I mean, other countries which we can emulate? I mean, don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel here.
There are many countries that have started their own tech industries. Some have gone even further to set up AI ministries.
AI ministries.
Right, but we don't need to reach that level. We should at least start with a tech ministry that could have oversight over this entire industry.
So what would a ministry like that be focused on? I mean,
so it would be focused on 2 things: generating demand and supply. Right, so generating demand means getting the industry, the general industry, to adopt ICT and digitalization, and supply is where generating enough tech companies to actually supply those to the general industry. right? And so that's kind of the focus that the ministry.
I guess I'm wondering because earlier we said that almost tech touches everything, right? Technology
Yes.
touches almost every industry, and
Yes.
in this day and age, you cannot afford not to be digital
Yep.
savvy. I guess I'm wondering, at the basis of all that lies broadband speed,
Yes.
right? And the cost of broadband. You mentioned the
Yep.
cost of adoption of all this.
Yep.
Malaysia, on the whole, our broadband is still relatively expensive.
Right. So one of the successes we've had in the IT Nexus is to implement or fully implement today the mandatory standard on access pricing. So if you notice over the last 1-2 years, the cost of broadband has gone down substantially.
That's true. That's
right?
true.
Especially with since the change of government, I think YB Gobin, the Minister of Communications, has put a push in terms of reducing the cost of broadband.
But what about the speed?
I think both of these, of course, is not an immediate increase,
see.
right? In fact, if you ask me, in the next 2 to 3 years, our problem will not be the speed. Our problem will be the applications for the speed.
What does that mean?
So what, for example, 5G. When 5G is actually implemented, the biggest issue is not going to be the availability of 5G, but what you use 5G for.
Okay. All right.
Right.
Well, I guess that's the basis of all, the improving the productivity within the ICT sector. We're going to come back and continue this conversation in just a couple of minutes. Make sure you don't go away. We'll be right back on Consider This. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you tonight, and we are chatting to GANESH Kumar BANGAH, who is a champion of the ICT Productivity Nexus under the Malaysia Productivity Blueprint. So GANESH, the idea of increasing productivity within the ICT sector, all of this is to drive the digital economy. You mentioned earlier there's been a lot of focus on the digital economy in Budget 2020. So talk to us a little bit about where you see the current state of Malaysia's digital economy adoption versus where you're hoping it's going to be within the near future.
So I think one of the drivers is e-commerce. And if you look at e-commerce today, about 6% of retail today actually is done online. Right? And if you go back 5 years, that was close to 1%.
We just had Singles Day, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
And then we're going to have Black Friday and whole Cyber Monday
Right.
and all
But
that.
6% sounds so
It's
small.
still pretty low
Low.
because in more developed countries like China and India, it's close to 20%.
Okay.
Right? But it's still a lot of room for growth. But we are heading in the right direction. And e-commerce and the digital economy really will start growing when we hit the inflection point. And I think we have hit the inflection point.
Oh, you think we have?
We definitely have hit that inflection
What would
point.
what would be an indicator of that? I mean, to kind of explain to our audience, what is it that you're looking at to suggest that?
So I think growth rates is important. Now, when you hit the inflection point, you tend to have more than double-digit growth rates, right? So you have more than double-digit growth rates, then that flattens to a double-digit growth rate. And if you look at over the last 4 to 5 years, we had more than double-digit growth rates when it comes to e-commerce. 1 to 6%. For the next 4 to 5 years, they're expecting that the e-commerce parcel increase will actually be 20% year on year. Right? So we're expecting e-commerce expecting to grow 20% year on year for the next 5 years.
So that's probably, I guess, as you talked about the inflection point, it has to do also with smartphone penetration within
Yes.
this within our country. But when it comes to, I guess, the ecosystem, the infrastructure built for e-commerce, being a conducive environment for e-commerce, what would your comment be? Are we a conducive business environment to grow e-commerce?
I believe there's been a lot of progress over the last 4 to 5 years, which is why we've kind of reached the inflection point, or we have reached the inflection point. If you look at our logistics services, they've improved substantially over the last few years. Payment services, we have so many different kinds of payment services. E-wallets is getting very prevalent. So we now have the infrastructure of business environment to actually promote e-commerce, and that's why it's growing. And our consumers, especially our younger generation, is quickly adopting this. Like buying online is becoming second nature to them.
Right.
So in your work, I mean, you see the potential, obviously. question is, what are what are the headwinds for this? I mean, what are the challenges, and how can your work and the work of the stakeholders that you represent change that dynamic? How do you address them?
I think the biggest challenge for our local industry is the fact that as e-commerce becomes more prevalent, whether consumers are going to be buying from locals or foreigners.
Right.
Right? So as e-commerce becomes more prevalent, globally cross-border commerce is becoming even more prevalent. So today you can buy something from China quite easily on Lazada. So how do you make sure that our SMEs are the ones that are supplying to our consumers, and it's not the Chinese SMEs or the Indonesian SMEs that are supplying to them? So that's a war.
Right.
Right?
I mean, philosophically though, I mean, if we want open borders and we want our SMEs to sell in foreign countries, shouldn't we also be equally agnostic about where we get our stuff up, as long as it's good quality?
We should be. But the challenge really is that if the foreign SMEs are better knowledge or better educated, have the right talent to actually market to consumers and know how to adopt these technologies better than our local SMEs, then we will lose, our local SMEs will lose out. So that's where we need to ensure that our local SMEs are able to adopt the right skill sets to actually compete against global SMEs. I'm not saying we should close our borders. I'm just saying we must make sure we are as knowledgeable and are ready to compete with foreign SMEs and foreign players as well.
Where do you see the gap in the market? I mean, clearly you are within the space, you've been watching it for a while. We're never going to compete with China for mass-produced items. We're never going to compete in that cost or that space.
Yes.
But where do you see Malaysia's SMEs perhaps grabbing a slice of the pie?
So I think Indonesia will be a big market for us. So you know, e-commerce penetration across the e-commerce market in Southeast Asia is expected to grow from something like, actually Google Temasek 2 years ago did a report, and they said it's going to grow from 25 billion 2 years ago to 100 billion by 2025. They recently reviewed those numbers, and it's now something like 30 billion.
Wow.
And it's going to grow to like over 100, I think it was 118 billion or something. And the fastest growing market is actually Indonesia. And our proximity to Indonesia, our cultural assimilation to Indonesia means we will be able to supply a lot of our products, whether it's halal products or other type of products, to that huge market. So that's a market we should be focusing on as we expand, right? The growth is not in China. The growth of consumer demand for e-commerce and the digital economy is not in China. The growth is in Southeast Asia. That's why you see so many Chinese companies now focusing on Southeast Asia and investing here, right? Alibaba's investing here, Tencent's investing here, all the large players. They're not staying in China, they're coming over here. And even more, they're coming to Indonesia. The big question is our local industries, our SMEs ready to adopt that?
I do want to ask about our local SMEs. I mean, you say, as you rightly pointed out, they're kind of backbone of our economy, but they're not known to be the employers of great talent necessarily, right? I mean, the question is why? Why aren't they investing in talent, quality talent for their own future? Why isn't it that they are, not the ones making these initiatives, and it seems to be coming from the National Malaysian Productivity Corporation and such, which are government.
I think the SMEs are starting to see the need of this type of talent. The only issue is, if you talk about technology, the first thing coming to mind of a SME is I need to hire a programmer. Right? I need to hire a programmer to develop something. I need to hire a tech guy to develop something. But that's not the challenge today. Today, developing a software or developing a product or developing a website, anybody can do it. Your key success factor is not developing the website to sell or developing the e-commerce store to sell. You have Shopify, you have so many different apps. The key success factor is actually your go-to-market strategy. It's how you take your product and take it to market. Right? It's digital marketing, it's performance marketing, it's influencer marketing, right? And
that's the soft stuff, right? Where creativity and design.
Not really. When it comes to the online industry or the internet industry, that's not soft. That's actually analytics. Right? Marketing
big
today,
data and stuff.
Big data. Marketing today is all about analytics.
Well, Ganesh, in the last minute that we have left, could you just wrap up? I'm sure there are a lot of viewers watching who are perhaps involved in SME. What words would you have for the mass champion of the ICT Productivity Nexus to perhaps embrace a new world of digital?
Sure. I think SMEs in Malaysia have to quickly embrace tech and not to be too scared about it. Get beyond the buzzwords and focus on what digitalization can do to help their business in terms of increasing revenue and reducing costs. And by that virtue, increasing productivity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being
Thank
on
you.
the show. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have on the show. And consider this tonight. Sharaad and I will be back with another episode with you, 10 p.m. same time tomorrow. We'll see you then. Signing off.